our young people have taken to the streets and the police have tanks that are coming out. That was a heartbreaker for me. And still dressed in that suit, went out into the Andy Warren parking lot that's right across the street from the Ferguson Police Department and stood with people, strangers. I didn't know anybody out there. But what I experienced that night was completely different from what people had said was happening. When I got out there were drummers. That was like the thing that I remembered the most. There was a drummer just like banging. And people were chanting and dancing and making their own chants. And there was community being built because there was a woman by the name of Mama Cat who was out there. And she had all of these snacks, and she started serving us snacks. There was a rapper by the name of Tough Poe who was like calling all the shots. And at the time of night when things got chaotic, he was the one who told us to kneel to the ground and put our hands up. And the reason that he told us to do that was because by this time, there was an alderman who had been arrested and a lot of reporters and journalists who were across the street. And around 11:30, 12 o'clock around that night, the tanks had come back out. And alongside the tanks were these officers who were carrying their guns and flashing these lights into our faces and saying that if we do not disperse, they will arrest. And I remember an officer pointing his gun at us, and that's when Tough Poe said, "Get on your knees." Because if you're on your knees and they know that these newscasters are out there watching that and they shoot you or they do something to you, we have the win in that optic. But what I don't think Tough realized was that by telling us to get on our knees with our hands up, that became a different positioning. And in doing that, there was a woman who started walking around in the midst of all of us. And she started speaking in tongues. And there were some people around me, and I couldn't see their faces because I was so scared that my eyes were closed. But I remember hearing people pray out loud. These are the things that you don't hear or see in the news articles. But that was what I experienced on that first night. And I was so haunted. I was so moved by it. I was so traumatized by it that I started to have a series of nightmares. And so skipping ahead to that mirror casket came out of those series of nightmares. But I wasn't the only person who was going through things at that time. There were people like Elizabeth Vega who were literally just doing whatever was possible, bringing materials out into the streets, giving people the canvas to make their voices and their opinions known, providing art therapy on the streets of Canfield where Mike Brown was shot with the little kids. Because if you listen to the story of Elizabeth Vega, she'll tell you about this 3-year-old who saw Mike Brown when he was in the street and how he was traumatized. And how, as a caretaker, as a nurturer, and as a grandmother, her response was to hold that baby and bring him some teddy bears and some toys. And that led into having these therapeutic sessions with children on the streets, more things that you didn't see in the newscasts. But there were also many of us who were making our own art, making our own creations, just to get the feelings and the emotions out of our heads, day after day. Going into the streets, making art and protest, making banners, creating with the people. This is another image of the mirror casket when it was created and how it became this symbolic object for this movement. When it was actualized, there were so many people who had came out into the streets that there were men who organized themselves to be the pallbearers of this casket, to carry it into crowds and across the city from Ferguson, from where Mike Brown was killed on Canfield to the Ferguson Police Department, and then again from Keener Plaza to the police headquarters in downtown St. Louis. And the magic of a piece like this was that when you walk on the sides of it, the mirrors are all clear. And it evokes you to empathize with the possibility that perhaps you could be inside of that. Perhaps you are responsible for this trend. Perhaps the reflection, the reverberation could move you to believe that there is a possibility of change. But the thing is about this piece, as you can see in the bottom left corner, is that when you turn it upwards, that face of it is cracked intentionally. And these men decided to pose it, to present it to the police every time that they carried it. And what you would get was this shattered image when you look into it. Tweaking that sense of reflection to really say, who are we becoming? As we continue to be complicit and implicitly responsible for the deaths of so many people in our nation and in our city, who are we becoming? That is what we use art to provoke and to make us think about here in this city. And yes, that piece ended up getting collected, and what happened was that we were able to start convening even more people all across the city in so many different ways, in museums, in schools, in churches, all over, to create, to perform, to share their own stories and come up with solutions for what could potentially be ways of addressing some of these micro issues that were resident in the death and the killing of not only Mike Brown, but Derek Myers, Kiwi Herring now just this year, Anthony Lamar Smith, who we're still protesting for justice for. And what came out of so much of these moments of using art, using story, using these common cultural denominators like food, public space, was that we were able to get over 3,000 people organized week after week with what became the Ferguson Commission. And now that commission has transformed into Forth through Ferguson, which has carried that report that was created by the people and said, hey, all of these leaders, all of these politicians, all of these business owners, what are we going to do? There are 189 calls to action that people, that activists, that organizers, that young people, that grandmothers, that students, that clergy have created. How are we going to actualize that? To this day, I sit on the board of directors of that new organization as the youngest member in the room. And art is still part of that conversation of, well, how do we actually get this out to the people? How do we make sure that this report isn't just something that's sitting on the shelf? How do we activate it and implement it? Organizing and convening and having public intervention has been so much a part of this process. These are just some examples. Damon Davis, if you've seen the film, the documentary Who Streets, he was a part of the Mirror Casket Project as well. And he was one of the local people who told the story of what was happening here to really center not only just the voices of people, but the voices of queer people of color. Because let me not get this wrong, so many of our frontliners were queer people of color. And so often when we say that Black Lives Matter, we ignore black queer lives, gay lives, lesbian lives, trans lives, poor lives, homeless lives. And Damon wanted to make sure that was a part of the story, that was centered in the midst of all of this. Just continuing on with some more. So faith, which is so crucial to being able to be a part of a movement, to hold on to a steady belief in something, in possibility, in truth. In my faith, we often say that faith is, the belief in the things that are unknown and unseen. That it is the conviction that even if things are not already actualized, that we will get there. And often on the streets, I think faith becomes conflated with religion often, which has definitely a lot of regard. But I see faith in a lot of our chants. When we say that I believe that we will win, that is faith. When we write things like, we have nothing to lose but our chains, that belief that we have so much to gain on the other side of liberation and of freedom, that is faith. The ability to go in and day out and face upfront and courageously and unflinchingly the very systems and oppressors that have existed for so long. To do that without flinching, that is faith, that is courage. And for me, it's been a privilege to be a part of this city, of what's happening, and not necessarily just in the matter of protesting issues and challenges and inequities, but also creatively being in spaces to envision something better, to think about what liberation could look like in this city. And that is something that I like to massage with audiences. And so I wanted to do a quick activity with all of you. And some of the materials that you'll use is on your table, but before we hop into that, I wanted to also open this for conversation, to get your feedback, your insights, your questions as well. Does anybody have anything? Or we can just sit with that, take it in.
Have you ever talked before to a group of religious educators? Is there anything specific to us that connects to what you're saying?
I think so in some ways. That sense of how do we invoke courage into practice. And what does that look like when teaching, when engaging with others? I think as well, through some of these stories, through some of these moments, there's a paradigm shift that is happening, that is underway. And the expansion of how we think about religion, spirituality, and faith is rapidly morphing into this intersection of where culture meets history, meets justice, meets all of these things. And at least for a lot of faith leaders that I know, and a lot of young people as well who are being challenged in our own beliefs, in our own faiths, I think there's a shift that's happening in how people educate, and the stories that we tell ourselves, the things that we have to challenge ourselves to unlearn and relearn, and what are the points of intersection of scripture, of theological pedagogy that really plays a part in what's happening on the ground in the everyday lives of people. I think in terms of research and practice, that's how I see it. As someone who's not like a professor at all, I don't know. But I'm curious if you see that connection.
I'm getting to be an old man now, so they don't change very easily. But last week I was in Brazil with young people in an education institute, and I used photographs from the favelas and art from the favelas and from my own country of South Africa in this class. For the first time in my life, using art and photography to
think that the activism part is too results oriented, so I'm just curious about.
Yeah, taking on your first question of if I can reframe it or rearticulate it, is art educational? And does the education produce the art? I think it's a yes and. I think for me, I've learned so much about the world and learned so much about other cultures and other people through art and through art making, through creation, often creating with people. But I think when we get to the point where the world ends, so much of what will be left are the art forms. Whether you see that as the books and the literature of a society, the arts that are visual and within different institutions, or the practices, the cultural arts, I think about like Negro spirituals, like the things that live on through the manifestation of people. I think all of those become educational as art forms. I also think that art is a process. And so in many ways, with going back to the gentleman's story about how art has been a teaching tool, I think we learn more about ourselves through the process of art, of engaging in making. And so, yes, like yes and. But the second question, I don't know. Yes.
So, one of the many statements that you offered us, one in particular was very powerful for me when you talked about the first night that you went out to protest, and these were your words. There was community being built. And then what you went on to describe for me was a service of worship. Those were not your words, but this is what you said. You talked about a drummer offering beats, a mama pole,
Mama Cat.
mama cat,
Yes.
distributing food. You talked about a rapper offering words and leadership, specifically get on your knees with your hands up. You talked about people praying out loud and speaking in tongues, which in my setting is what you described was worship. That was a service of worship. And it reaffirms for me this belief that we have a translation problem between those spaces of religious gathering and those spaces where young adults are gathering. And if we would just encounter one another using our language and listen to one another, we would find spaces of places of resonance. But that was powerful, and I'm going to probably use it somewhere. I'll attribute it to you.
Do it. Go for it. No, so even prior to that experience, I used to be a part of a church called Middle Tree Church, and there would be some services at least once a season where we would go out and have church outside. This was a church that didn't have its own building. We often had worship at different schools and other churches that had been vacant, but it was always that experience that we would come and put up the stage, put up all the chairs, and then at the end of service take it all back down. And it became so much easier with that church to simply have church outside, to meet people where they are, and serve coffee in the same way that we would do, but sing and praise and dance and have ministry in public. And I think even in addition to that particular night, that is something that I've seen happen in different parts of our journey in these past few years, where it may not necessarily be someone who has been ordained in ministry who is teaching or leading the service, but that sentiment is that we're here, that like there's a common belief in our sense of justice, but through the tools that everybody has, this is what we're gonna do. With what's been happening with the verdict of Jason Stockley and Anthony Lamar Smith here in the city, there have been nights where several protesters and organizers and street medics, lots of different people have been kettled into mass arrests. And those of us who were not arrested would go to the Justice Center downtown, and that same type of experience would happen, where everyone would bring waters and snacks and food. People would come out with their drums. I want to uplift Brother KB, who always comes out in his with his bongos, and he is a black trans Jewish rabbi. Like he does so much, and he brings out all of these drums with so many other musically capable activists, and it keeps the crowd going the entire night until they leave. And we don't see that as church, but yes, as someone who has experienced that in my own faith, that is an element of it.
In your circles kind of work and exposure, how much is art response and how much of it art is proactivity?
Ooh, a little bit of both. For me, if I had to give like a percentage, I would say it's like the 60-40, that 60% of the time where, actually I would say like 70-30. 70% of the time we're responding. 30% of the time we're actually just in a basement creating. Actually, it's not even 70-30. Like we're often creating to provoke, to preempt something. Like even today, there was a street theater that was happening that's based upon this show called How to Get Away with Murder. And for weeks, people have been designing these flyers, and like rehearsing and practicing. And around 9:30 this morning, they took to an intersection, I don't even know where, but they performed this skit, this theatrical production, and it wasn't necessarily in response to something really immediate, but I feel like oftentimes life is always in response to something. That coming out of the blue with an idea usually has some catalyst, even if it's not an immediate reaction. I would also say that there's a growing cohort of artists, people who convene at this place called the Art House. There's an activist, Elizabeth Vega, who I showed in one of the slides, who bought a house simply to be a safe haven for different organizers, especially organizers of color. And that house has transformed in so many ways to provide art therapy to the kids in the neighborhood. They have this partnership with Whole Foods that now they feed the people and provide meals every Saturday and Wednesday. And that's not necessarily in response, but the house also becomes this convener for just bringing people together to come up with ideas, and we have what are called art builds. And a lot of that production happens there. But I'm still challenged by, like, are we responding, even though in the experience it feels like we are creating just by pure internal inspiration or collective inspiration? Because sometimes it's like, we'll have a great conversation over a meal and an idea sparks. So yes and. I feel like I'm giving a lot of yes and answers.
Hi, my name is Monte, and I serve at a university in San Diego. Let me first say thank you so much for sharing this. Very inspirational, and I can just think of several students who I know they would love to meet you. I texted a few of them, I'm like, check out her website. So, just thank you. Tomorrow I'm presenting a paper that talks about a pilgrimage that a few students came with me on here in St. Louis and Ferguson, where we met with different activists and heard several stories similar to what you shared about being out there, connecting with Wellspring and all of that. And out of that experience, we did a lot of really cool creative things and ended up practicing Eucharist or communion at the site where Michael Brown was killed.
Wow.
And we did a lot of creative things along the way. And it was very communal. And even today, I mean, we have this text group that doesn't stop because of what was created, not just out here, but among each other. And there are so many different artistic elements. And at times, the one thing I get bothered by is this sense that it can never be done again. It was so creative, so artistic, that like when I think about a trip like this, it's like, well, that was awesome. That's gonna end right there. What do you do with the fact that art is not reproducible?
Or is it?
Or is it?
Right. So I'll respond with a story, with a project, namely the Mary Casket project. And that one is fresh of mind because literally a week ago, last Friday, I had to give a TEDx talk, and it was just about that project. And part of what I shared at the end was how for the last few months, especially because I have this fellowship with the Kennedy Center in DC for like performing arts, and the question that we often get is, what's next with this piece? It's been collected, but is the story over? And we know that we can't do much with that piece because it's not in our ownership, our immediate ownership anymore. But in a lot of these travels, people say, well, what if you created another one or a similar one that was with our community because we face this issue? What does it look like to make a small version of this casket and actually give it to the family of someone who's experienced the loss of a loved one because of, in this case, police brutality? What does it look like to iterate or pivot the idea or the spirit of the project and help manifest it either with another community that you're a part of or have been invited to be a part of, or through another form of it? With what you're saying, it's hard to recreate communion, especially with the same people. But I wonder if the core of that practice could be something that, or like the energy of it, could be something that you could collectively bring to another space or another community with either the same students or more. Yeah. Yep. Let's go back over here.
Question, I mean, it's following up on the last two. Art is also provocative.
Yes.
So how do you discern when provoking action is appropriate and healthy and when it isn't? Or when it may not be healthy?
Right. Now we're getting into like this art historical canon of a lot of pedagogy in the art field of how does public perception of a creation or a performance or an artwork navigate its existence in a space. This has also been something that has been top of mind here in St. Louis because in the midst of all of this, I used to be based at the Contemporary Art Museum here, and we had an exhibition where there was an artist who had works of art that, to many people on a local scale, were extremely offensive when it came to Black bodies. There were several pieces that took archival images from the 60s and smeared white chocolate, milk chocolate, and dark chocolate over the images of Black men who were getting bitten by police dogs as like a cop was looking. And that museum said, well, we can't censor an artist because as an institution, that is a violation of art with a capital A, that all art that is created should have its space, that the artist should have justification in their creations. And for me, as someone who is working with community, and as someone who's a community artist and also a person of color who's deeply offended, I felt conflicted in that notion because I was like, take it off the walls. Like, it was a very simple solution. And with protest art, with public intervention, public art, a lot of those same grievances come up, those same conflicts in terms of the artist's right to express what they feel is in their hearts or on their minds or a reflection of the world around them. And the ability, in some ways, responsibility or decision of a public to say, we don't want it. There's a long history of those types of conflicts. I think for myself, I think is that discernment, that for me as a creator, that I'm not going to put anything out into the world that I don't stand by. So even if that piece offends someone, which in the case of the mirror casket, it offended a lot of people, to be told to look at yourself, when right now in our society that is such a hard thing, that because it means letting go of a lot of things that we've learned about ourselves. I think that is hard. It is hard to look at what might be considered a flaw of ourselves as humans. And so, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that conflict is always there, for sure. I wanted to do a quick time check. Oh, I see the time now. Because there is an activity that we wanted to do, and I'm also noticing these pop-ups on the computer screen, which I'm sure you are too. I have no idea what that is. And I bring that up mainly because the exercise is also through these slides, if that's fine. But perhaps one or two more questions. Do we have enough time for that? All the way in the back.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I am really grateful for a number of things that you said, and one of the things that I want to lift up now is a question that you posed to us, and that is, and I think I'm quoting you, how do we invoke courage through our teaching? And so I want to respond to your question and invite my colleagues here that feel the urge to also respond, because I think that's a really good question that you posed to us. And so I'm going to respond in this way. I would hope that my teaching encourages those who will teach and preach to do that in an uncompromising way so that it motivates the changes in policy, particularly public policy, as well as policies in churches. Now, that's my hope, but I'm realizing it takes time for me to actually see the evidence of that. But I still, in the hope of doing that as I teach, must push forward towards that, because I think that's a really important question, that how do we teach for courage? And I'm learning a lot from Black Lives Matter movement and all of those leaders that have come forth, yourself, in that your courage is embodied. You literally lay your bodies down so that, as you say, if you're going to die for anything, we will, if we have nothing to lose but our chains. That's an act of saying, I will die for freedom. So I invite us to respond to the question about how do we teach for courage, and I thank you for a beautiful question.
Thank you. I wonder, like, just taking the temperature of the room, would you like to spend time teasing out some of those possibilities to that question? Or would you like to sit with it?
Several years ago, I was part of a group of religious educators and Christian ministers who put together a worship service with a casket, and it was an open casket for a while. And it was very intentional in asking this question: what needs to die in the church in order for there to be true resurrection of the body of Christ? And that was one way that I answered that question, and a couple other people who were in this room were part of that, and I'm wondering how we might do things like that in the classroom.
Wow. I don't have that answer, but that's a powerful question. Indeed. In the back.
I would like to take her question one step further. What must die in the church so that the world can live?
Yeah. What must die in the church so that the world can live?
I think that one thing I can do in my classroom to make available to my students some opportunity for courage is to show that people are doing stuff. Like
Yeah.
stuff like that. It's possible, look.
Indeed. Yeah, when I was an educator, a museum educator, one of the things, and when I was in sales, different phase of life, one thing that we would often say, show, teach, never tell, that people can learn if you can show examples, if they can see themselves activated in a situation, and if they can see the truth that things are possible. I think that is definitely a good way to spark that courage all the way in the back.
I don't know whether you know this or not, but the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. just opened, has recreated the funeral parlor for Emmett Till.
Yep.
So if we go back to Emmett Till, and we remember what happened to Emmett Till, and we link Emmett Till to the 3 to 4 black lives a day that are killed by law enforcement, according to the Guardian report, the decision his mom needed to make: do I have an exposed open coffin with my son totally mutilated, or do I have a closed coffin and just let people pass? And her decision to have it photographed and published in the media was a milestone or a real point in U.S. history that unfortunately keeps repeating. So I don't know whether you have any response to that
Yeah.
that exhibit in the museum, which recreates that. People process in and stop at the coffin as if they're in a funeral parlor passing by. They just have this photo inside the casket, but it recreates that moment with pictures and video around that event.
I do indeed have many responses to that. That was actually part of why this casket was collected, was because in 2014, when we first launched or presented this piece to the public, it took several months for it to get to the word of folks at the Smithsonian for or as they call it, the Blacksonian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And in those conversations, that was the direct link, that this is something that continues to happen. In their September 2016 edition, Angela Davis, the activist, Angela Davis wrote an article about the mirror casket that was featured, and one of the images that I had where you just see it with the black background, that is all that you see on that spread with like a small column of her text. And she details a bit of that connective tissue between what was happening in the 50s and what was happening now. When that museum opened, we were invited, myself, the carpenter who did a lot of the building of that infrastructure on the casket, and one of the performers, we were all invited to, of course, to the museum, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but also to give a talk at Busboys and Poets in Georgetown about this piece and our journey to the Smithsonian. And in both of those cases, and in every conversation of presenting that specific piece since, the question is always a notion of, well, when they put yours on display, how do you want people to experience it? Because when you experience Emmett Till's, it is indeed that of a funeral. And we said, well, ours wasn't used in a funeral. Like Mike Brown was not in that. Nothing was in that casket. Just as a side note, one of the design decisions that almost made it into it was to fill that casket with the writings and poetry and reflections of people and fill it with those types of writing. And we ran out of time. We didn't have the time to instill it in there. But that question that we get is often, what do you want the experience of this to be when it's on the exhibit? And we said, well, we want it to be like the night that it was. We want it to be in the air, so that as you're walking past it, you see a bit of yourself as you're standing inside of it. With the audio, so in the exhibition with Emmett Till, there's a wall that splits where the casket is, and then there's a lot of archival articles and I believe 2 videos that play on the other side of the wall. And we said we don't really want all of that. We just want people to have the sound of what was happening on that night. The calm when people were walking with the casket, the noise that flared up once we were outside of the police department, and the experience of seeing those two, I think would allow people to see that bridge even more clearly. But yes, it is definitely an intention of their collection. A few more, and then I promise we're gonna get to this activity. All the way in the back.
Okay, so as a follow to one of the earlier questions about teaching and also one of the comments you made in your presentation, what would you offer as a starting point for how we can start to reform or reimagine theological pedagogy? I think you referred to it as in your presentation, in light of the work that you're doing and what you're observing on the ground.
Can you rephrase that for me?
Okay.
Just like say it again.
Okay, you want me to say it again?
Yes.
All right, what would you offer as a kind of starting point for how we begin to think about our pedagogy, right, of theology and religious education differently in light of the work that you're involved in on the ground?
Yeah. I think there could be so much. I think part of it is the word that is coming like to heart is the word relevance. Of what can we help people identify across faiths and in religions and scriptures and in texts and practices that speak to the challenges that are relevant to today. What are those parts of our practices within our schools, our classrooms, the churches that we engage, that are the disconnect? And I like the question that was, or the way that it was framed earlier, like what needs to die in the church so that the world can live. I think that self-check of, or assessment of, what are the different parts of our practices that might push people further away than bringing them in? How do we instill like that notion of how do we meet people where they are? I know a lot of folks my age where we're like, I'm not really rocking with like the minister in his suit who's like teaching me the same thing about like not having sex before marriage. Like when there are meditative practices that speak to the everyday stress that I'm actually facing. If that makes sense. Like, what are those connections? I think in many cases, it's also a matter of generationally, who are the teachers? Can we step aside out of our own pride, our own egos, our own legacies to listen to others in the room, to others in the classroom, to others in the space, in the congregations? I think, and I say this because it's come up in one of my other projects called Sticky Notes itself. There's a note that I once wrote that was all about living experts. That there's so much wisdom, there's so much ability to see God in another person, sometimes who may not be practicing a certain religion or faith. And how do we see that? How do we see people where they are and learn from that? I think that could create a shift in the ways that we think of, like, who's the expert, who's the student, how do we humble ourselves in practice, in praise, in the process. And I think, what are those relevant points of what people are really facing in our communities and in our society?
I just want to thank you again for what you said, and just based on what you have just said, which came to my mind as you were talking about how do we have equitable, open room space that doesn't alienate.
Yeah.
And so much of the Christian tradition, because that's the one I'm familiar with, is accused, and rightly, of alienating many people. But if we, despite the traditions that we come from, believe that the divine seeks to draw everyone to themselves, and if, as you say, we look around in our rooms, I don't have a classroom yet, but I hope to have one. But if we look around in our classrooms and recognize that the great teacher is not we, but is the one who has orchestrated this gathering, and who has given us people among us to draw out their truths, then we wouldn't want to alienate anyone, would we?
Right.
And then if the truths are there for us to facilitate, we are the facilitators of the truth, and we humbly accept that role and treat it responsibly, I believe we will see things that we have never believed to be possible.
Indeed. What she said. So I would love to continue conversation, but I want to get you conversing a bit at your tables. And what you'll see on your table are a few things. There's, of course, markers. There are sticky notes. There are index cards. And at the bottom of each table, there is a pile of images. Some of those images, and I'm so trying to see what this is.
Yeah, just turn them off.
Let's do that? Yeah. Each person at your table should grab an image. And that image might be of some challenges. Some may be hard to look at. I believe there might be some that are stats and facts. There will be some that are also harmonious. And there will be some that, there might be some in some tables that are also creative. Every person should grab an image for his or herself, or themselves. And we're gonna do a quick, very quick exercise about encountering and responding to what we encounter. So once you have your image, just thinking to yourself, really assess what's in that image. What do you see? if there is a character or an action that's happening, what is happening in that image? Where do you think this exists? Who do you think is involved in whatever that image is? And who do you think is affected? So I'm going to let out a secret that at your table, all of your images relate to a certain social topic, social issue. And we'll have time for you to discuss amongst yourselves, but for the first part of this exercise, once you really engage with what's in the image, simply introduce it to your group. Don't analyze it, just say, my image is a photo of XYZ. You can talk about it.
Shared space of with an engine, just power, but it's shared space with non-conscious and my appreciation for the power and non-power side by side and having to exist.